All right, well, let me press the live button and we'll get going. All right, it says we're live. Always press live with some trepidation, not knowing if everybody can hear us or not. But welcome to those who are already watching. My name is Robert Baines. I'm the president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable organization dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians don't have to think about these issues, which is great, obviously, in some ways, but it also leaves us open to all sorts of misfortunes when we don't plan, we don't pay attention, and therefore we don't start building the foundations that we need to meet the world in the 21st century. We've done this for many, many years, since 1966. We are a community that tries to reach out to different areas of Canada, all over the country, putting on events, writing articles, and of course, reaching out through social media. If you would like to be a part of our organization, please do follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course, here on YouTube as well. Right now, we're going to be talking a little bit about the 2% GDP expectation of defense spending, which NATO put forward in the 2014 NATO summit in Wales. The past few weeks, there have been even more discussions than usual about this metric and how useful it is to measure defense spending and contributions to NATO. We've got an amazing panel for us here today, absolute experts who have been toying and tinkering with this idea, the problems, and hopefully the solutions, which we'll talk about today as well. To bring us through this discussion, we have Dr. Christian Leuprecht, a great friend of our organization, and he is class of 1965 distinguished professor at RMC, the Royal Military College. He's also editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal, an outstanding publication. And he also directs the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at the School of Public Studies and is an adjunct research professor in the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security at Charles Sturt University. He's also been associated with the NATO Defense College, of course, and Johns Hopkins University as well, to mention a few. Christian, it's an absolute pleasure to help you take our panel through the discussions today. Really look forward to it, and hopefully we have some chance for some questions from the YouTube community as well. So if you are on YouTube, please start putting in your questions, and we'll filter them through to the panel. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the kind introduction there. And look, I think this is a long-standing topic, at least since for the past 50 years. And so I think it's never been more apt than today, because of course the security environment is changing quickly, and there's lots of debate about whether Canada is postured effectively for what awaits us today, let alone what awaits us tomorrow. And that in a context where, as people have probably heard me say before, we've lived in an environment of benign neglect for the last 20 years, where governments have focused on operations. And you'll be familiar with sort of the infamous Prime Minister Harper quote, more teeth, less tail. But of course, I don't know any animals that just have teeth and tail. The animals that I know all have a body. And so that body in the military is known as sustainment. And the tail is the constitution or reconstitution part. So this is sort of where you actually got to bring in the people and you got to train up the people. And so arguably, when you're 10,000 people short operationally, this is what you get when sort of for 20 years, all politicians focus on is just sort of the operational side and not realize you need to sustain and you need to constitute the organization. Now, the 2% goal, I suppose this is also in the context of, look, for the better part of 25 years, Canada has been very lucky that we've essentially been able to choose the missions that Canada goes on, and Canada's been able to choose the force packages that it takes on these missions. So you can sort of adjust based on what you think you can contribute and how you want to contribute. And what we've seen over the last 14 months or so is, of course, that we no longer have that luxury, not as an ally, not as a partner, that our allies have come and set specific expectations, and we've had significant challenges meeting those expectations. And that comes at a cost. The cost is that your voice around the table is vastly diminished, that NATO is often compared to a six-pack. When you go to the beer store and you get yourself a six-pack, you don't like all flavors equally. And the Canadian flavor has always been a very popular flavor, precisely because it's a flavor that comes well trained up, well equipped, and a flavor that you don't have to babysit, where you can trust that when the Canadians say, this is what we're going to do, that you can trust that they'll actually get it done. But I mean, even if as we just saw sort of this week, the assets, the people are extremely stretched. And so when you're then trying to pile something on that was unexpected and unplanned, all of a sudden, it becomes very difficult to muster the forces and the assets. And it comes at a bit of a zero-sum game increasingly, where if you're going to do one thing, you can't do another thing. There's we're trying to figure out how to pull back, but you can't pull back piecemeal. You have to pull back in a strategic and systematic fashion. And as I've argued elsewhere, we probably need a 15-year multi-partisan plan to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces. And so I say this because, of course, people like to focus on the metrics and the quantity, and sort of we can measure how much we spend. But look, in fiscal year 2021, the department gave back $1.5 billion. So yes, money is a problem. But in some ways, it is not necessarily the single overarching problem. Even if the government today went from what we spend today to 2%, we don't have the policies in place. We have procurement processes that can barely manage the procurement projects that we have on the go, let alone then piling on sort of new projects. So we have hundreds of policies that, because we haven't had time to work on them, are hopelessly out of date, that are making it very difficult for the organization to adapt. So all that to say is that, yes, money is important, but is only one piece of a much broader conversation about how Canada contributes. And of course, Canada has always said that it's about the 3 C's, capabilities, commitments, and cash. And Canada has for 25 years said, look, don't worry about the cash. We've got the capabilities and we've got the commitments. And increasingly, we're seeing that we're being hard stretched on both the capabilities and commitments. So to bring us sort of into the 2% sort of debate. Now, the 2% goal was, of course, always aspirational. So from the outset, people had to pick a figure, and the Americans always knew from the outset that you had to keep allies, that NATO wasn't part of herding the kittens exercise. And why have the Americans not quit NATO? Well, because it's an extremely efficient way to organize allies and partners. Nowhere in the world do the Americans arguably invest less for greater payoff than they do in Europe. It's an extremely efficient tool to organize sort of collective action problems and resolve collective action problems. But one of the risks that always existed is when you have one partner who's so big, then other partners might not always meet their commitment to spend. And look, the 2% sort of burden sharing debate and arguably crisis goes back to December 1953, John Foster Dulles. So these aren't new debates sort of per se, but of course, when you have Canada, depending on which side sort of you believe in the story, but when you have Canada being marginalized by allies when it comes to AUKUS, arguably the most important technology sharing agreement in the last 20 years, when you have consensus -1 decisions at NATO, where Canada is essentially the one country that gets left out of the decision making, and when Canada at times at NATO has not been given the time that it might have liked to speak to particular issues, it shows that this is an increasingly serious debate in terms of our reputation. And it's also a serious debate in terms of our foreign policy, because the greatest risk that Canada faces is ultimately being frozen out, being a medium-sized country in North America that's no longer relevant, where our allies in Washington say, well, if the Canadians don't want to play and don't want to invest, that's fine, but we'll just do it on our own. The Americans don't need us for NORAD. We're nice to have, and we're a partner that they like. But make no mistake, the United States does not need Canada to defend this continent. They could do it on their own if they had to and wanted to. And look, we got a shot across the bow from the French ambassador just a couple of weeks ago in terms of, is Canada going to step up or not? And so if Canada doesn't get taken seriously by its European allies, and if Canada's voice is diminished in Washington and in Europe, that means that our most important force multipliers for our foreign policy are lost on us. And then we become a country out where we've lost our ability really to shape the future and to shape the world. And if we live in a competitive, contested 21st century where democracy and the values that the government says it cherishes are under increasing duress, an investment in defense is ultimate investment in foreign policy, because defense is a foreign policy instrument. It is arguably, perhaps in the 21st century, your most important foreign policy instrument. So enough said, but all that to say is there's a much broader context to the conversation about 2% and why it matters. Of course, Canada at Wales committed to 2%. Canada committed again to the Trump administration. There's still no plan. And so you can see how, especially the United States, but also European allies, are getting a little bit frustrated where this conversation is going. But of course, this conversation is not just about NATO and Canada, it's about NATO more broadly. Other allies are heading towards 2.5% and 3%. Now they live in a more dangerous environment, but as we learned in the 20th century, anything that threatens the territorial integrity, the economic prosperity, the social harmony and the political stability of our European allies and partners is fundamentally runs counter to Canada's strategic interests. So look, by way of introduction, there's 3 fantastic papers that the audience can read up on, that each of the contributors here has provided. And there's a very useful introduction to those 3 papers. So let me introduce our 3 panelists. So Anessa Kimball, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the Faculty of Social Sciences and the directeur du Centre sur la Sécurité Internationale at l'Université Laval in Quebec City. She's also the co-director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network. Anessa writes predominantly on defense security cooperation. And her contribution, her written contribution that you'll find on NATO Association's website is Rethinking NATO's 2% Defense Spending Target 2023 Enlargement Canadian Defense Needs, Cooperative Bargaining Models and Institutional Outcomes. Second panelist is Elliot Hughes, Corporate Affairs Advisor and political commentator. Previously served as Director of Policy to Canada's Defense Minister and Deputy Policy Director to Canada's Finance Minister. Today, Elliot provides defense, technology, and financial sector clients with strategic advice and insight to achieve their government relations objectives. And Elliot provided a paper entitled Forget 2%, Think 40% Instead. And he'll let you in on that title, I'm sure, in just a moment here. And Ben Zyla, who is full professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, where he directs the Peace Building and Local Knowledge Network, a political scientist by training. His work is focused on peace building in fragile and conflict-affected societies, post-conflict reconstruction, collective action problems of international security organizations, and burden sharing in peace operations. And Ben was also a 2021 NATO Defense College Fellow of the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program funded by the Assistant Deputy Minister Policy in the Department of National Defense. And his paper contribution to this debate is why we need to study impacts when discussing NATO burden sharing. So we won't have any opening statements. Rather, we're going through a set of questions. And if you have questions, Robert will be happy to field those and pass those along for our conversation here this afternoon. And so we'll start with the question of what's the case for the 2% benchmark? And I'll go in the order in which I introduced our panelists. And so I'll ask Anessa Kimball as our first commentator on this question. So what's the case for the 2% benchmark?
Thank you, Christian, and thanks for the invitation again to this event to share a little bit about my reflections on 2%. And so the case for this is essentially, and in fact, I'm going to go back even further than 2014 and talk about the 2002 non-binding commitment to 2%. And so we're actually 2 decades into thinking about 2% kind of functionally by militaries. The commitment itself is, less than a decade old, but it's been around for a while. And so, why do we have this? Bargaining scholars say, well, this is what we call a rational focal point, right? It is a way for states to kind of collaborate on something that they all understand. It is understood by voters. In some senses, it is understood by the electorate and the public, right? And so this makes it kind of easy to talk about something that is very complicated at its heart. Also, in some senses, this speaks directly to the language of the treaty itself, right? And because if a state, and this is the logic behind it, if a state spends or allocates to this level, which is 2%, then capacities should be sufficient to contribute to the collective while maintaining national capabilities. This is Article 3, right? It speaks directly to the parties separately and jointly by means of their continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity. Right. And so 2% is really about this idea that if you spend this much, you're going to still be able to secure yourself, but also contribute to the collective. And so I think that that's important. But where it's limiting, right, is essentially the challenge that not everybody measures military expenditures the same way. And this doesn't say very much at all about what countries actually buy. And so with that, I will pass it on to the next person.
Thanks, Anessa. That's a lovely opening volley. Elliot Hughes.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks to the NATO Association and Robert for the invitation. And great to be here amongst such esteemed professors. I'm definitely not a professor, so I'll be bringing a different sort of angle to the discussion, hopefully rounding things out. I think this is a sort of a perfect place to start. I mean, the case for 2%, and Anessa touched on this, it's simple. People get it. People understand it. It's straightforward. So if I'm working in the marketing department of 2%, I love this idea. It's a simple idea to cut through the noise to voters, because as Anessa mentioned again, these are complicated, difficult issues to tangle with. To be able to tell people all we're asking for is 2%. 2% to people seems like a pretty fair, small, minuscule amount. How can we not agree to this? How can we not sign up for this rather small and sort of meager ask to defend our security? And so, the simplicity of it, I think, is both its sort of most powerful element, but also its most challenging. And I know we'll get into some of those challenges as the discussion goes on. But for me, it's this idea of 2%, simple idea, very straightforward, connecting with average Joes and Jills in a very sort of tangible, real way at a time, now more than ever, where ideas that are complicated are very difficult to penetrate and get through to people on a day-to-day basis.
Elliot, thank you. We'll see how Ben sort of complements that. Of course, Ben spans, like myself, the Atlantic here, and so has an appreciation, especially of Germany, which is also a country that has long been criticized for not meeting its spending targets. So, Ben Zyla, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christian, and thanks very much also for me to Robert and the association for inviting me to this panel. There's very little I can add, perhaps 3 or 4 sort of keywords that kind of pop up. The first one is, and I think it's an important point to make, is that the 2% is a political target. There's no such thing as a political sort of or an international law that says countries have to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. It's a political commitment that all allies agree to. So that's the first point. So it actually underlines the fact that NATO is not only a military organization, it's also a political organization where countries come together to share certain values, norms, and principles, and so forth. But ultimately, of course, that 2% target is also about coherence and commitment. It strengthens the alliance coherence because at the end of the day, without money, no organization would function. And the way states contribute to an organization sort of strengthens the internal coherence, and by that external coherence as well. And it's also about commitment. It's about a financial commitment, and we'll come to this in a second, I would imagine. The commitment is political, but it's also military. So there's various kinds and forms of commitments that allies make towards the alliance, and that is one of the things that is controversial. Like, what actually does count towards the 2% benchmark? Is it pensions? Can those be counted into the 2% target, or is it healthcare provisions for service members or civilians? So there's a whole range of things that allies count towards the 2% goal. So, but at the end of the day, there's two other sort of factors I think at play. One is alliance value and fairness in the alliance. So the 2% and countries spending certain amounts of money on the alliance kind of show and underline their commitment to the alliance, as I've just said, but it also shows the value of the alliance, like how much they appreciate the alliance. And in that sense, it's also about the fairness. So the distributive justice, if you want to put it in scholarly terms, that everybody more or less pays the same amount.
So Ben makes so all of you make, I think, some really important points, and of course all of you in one way or another brought up sort of how do you actually calculate what we spend, and of course there's an ally that recently went from 1.3 to 1.7% simply by rolling in their pension liabilities. People point out that of course the United States has very significant health and also pension liabilities that they roll into their spending. And of course, as a colleague of Elliot's once said to me, maybe it's not that Canada spends too little, maybe it's that the United States spends too much. So that there's always different types of perspectives. But ultimately, look, defense spending, I think, as sort of I hear you say, is an insurance policy. And ultimately, it's the politicians that we democratically elect that decide what premium they're willing to pay. So that raises then the question of what's wrong with the 2% metric and what are its limitations. And what obviously one obvious sort of comment in that regard is that Canada spending 1.4% gives us significantly different types of results than say a much smaller member spending 2% or even more than 2%. So Canada's point about sort of capabilities, commitments, cash, do we have to balance right? So my question to the three of you, what's wrong with the 2% metric and what are its limitations? And why don't I start with Elliot this time around?
Yeah, I might just zag for the fun of it, because I would imagine sort of the others may sort of take another point. In a lot of ways, I think it's a very effective mechanism by NATO, because you constantly sort of have it in sort of as a topic of discussion. You constantly have countries being pushed by others within it in a very gentle and diplomatic fashion, I would say, mostly, to sort of cajoling each other to try and hit the 2%. And, it reminds me of that quote, it's sort of democracy is the worst form of government except all others. I mean, with at least picking a number, as arbitrary and as sort of simplistic as it is, I think it's also very useful for NATO as the association, not of Canada, but the association itself, sort of NATO as a body, to be able to use it to drive and push and get more out of the membership. And so, just to, I guess, start the debate a little bit, sure, there are some things wrong with it. It's arbitrary, it's simplistic, it's open to interpretation, as we've touched on. But I would also say it's quite effective in the sense of being a useful ploy and a useful sort of number for NATO to use and to drive discussion, debate. And it's constantly in the news. Countries are always trying to reach it, and if you're not, you're on the bad books, you're in the good books, and so on. So I'll sort of start there, and maybe we can sort of get into a back and forth later on in the discussion, but I'll turn it back over to the others now.
Ben Zyla, so what's wrong with the 2% metric? What are the limitations?
Well, I can think of plenty of those problems associated with a 2% target. The one I think I've just mentioned, it's a political target. It's arbitrary. It's not binding. It's not a norm. There's no mechanism to enforce it. So it's one of those issues that is actually not in the Washington Treaty. So going back to the history of NATO in 1949, we find no provision in the Washington Treaty whatsoever. And actually, if you read the documents from the North Atlantic Council in those years, up until 1956, 1957, you don't see anything about a 2% target or actually cost sharing mechanism. So that is a problem. It's not sort of enshrined in the Washington Treaty, and therefore you can't really enforce it. Contrary to what Elliot just said, yes, it's a form of sort of public reminding states gently, but I think states also have to be, especially bigger states who spend more than 2% target, have to be very careful about sort of engaging in this sort of public shaming exercise of other allies, because at least from a sort of academic point of view, it's not being found as being effective. It's actually the contrary. This research that just came out a couple of weeks ago, actually showing that American shaming of during the Trump administration of other allies, Canada, Germany, and others, was actually not effective. It actually undermines not only the alliance, it also undermines the United States itself. The other problem, of course, is, well, which variables actually count? There's a number of scholars who have looked at different kinds of variables. Is it the input variables? Is it the output variables? Or, as I've suggested, is it perhaps that we need to think about other variables or other forms of studying NATO burden sharing? Is it perhaps something along the lines of impact? So in other words, what kind of difference do your commitments, your burden sharing commitments actually make once they reach sort of NATO? Another problem, of course, is that we're talking about very different countries, very different sort of predispositions in terms of material dispositions, in terms of finances, in terms of size, in terms of the population. So it's very difficult theoretically and methodologically to kind of, come up with a matrix, so to speak, of what a fair share of that sort of collective cost is. In spite of the fact, of course, that the collective good that NATO provides has changed over the years. It's not been constant since 1949. So NATO's public goods have changed over the years, and they have changed because, well, the global security environment has changed, people have changed, the context have changed. And so I don't think we can just sort of look at the burden sharing discussion, the 2% discussion, as just an input variable, how much you spend on defense, but rather to actually opening up and go beyond narrow rational calculations of what sort of goes in and what goes out. Like, what is the value that each country, for example, attaches to NATO, to NATO's public goods? And that really, kind of opens up the domestic politics discussion of how is this burden, this collective burden, being negotiated in the Canadian marketplace of politics, essentially. What do we make of it? I'm sure we're going to come back to this at some point. How do we sort of translate the collective burden that we're supposed to shoulder into sort of domestic politics? Like, how do we sell it to Canadians? Those are some ideas in terms of what I see as problems with the 2%.
Anessa Kimball, what's wrong with the 2% metric? What are the limitations?
So I'm going to rebound a little bit because what is good is that some of the comments that other people have had, I already kind of had prepared some thoughts about. And so, one of these things we talked about, Elliot, invoked the idea, well, is it a good or is it a bad target? Is it good or bad because only 1 in 3 allies actually meet this target? So is it a dartboard? Are we trying to kind of have a dartboard type thing where instead of, maybe hitting the center in 2%, we should think like managerial, like the managerial theory and organizational behavior. And so maybe we should think about it as a continuum, right? And so, you are complying as you are spending, but maybe you're not in full compliance. And so you're in partial compliance, right? And I think this speaks very much to Benjamin's arguments about stigmatization, right? And so if you remove the you comply or you don't kind of, argument and discourse, then you've changed a little bit the game. And so this also is extremely related to the fact, and, this was brought up. And so I did some comparisons because I'm out here doing the math like a defense economist would. And so one of the things that is extremely challenging is the larger the size of your economy, the harder it is to do anything to move that 2%. And so what I did, because I want this to be real for people, I looked at, for instance, the 2014 NATO budgets that were the actual changes in what countries actually spent in GDP. And so what is interesting is that in 2014, we could see, for instance, that Lithuania had the largest change in GDP military spending, but that military spending is still owned less than 3% of Canada's entire budget and less than 1/5 of the percent of the US military budget. Right. And so we simply have these differences of magnitude that are huge between the allies. And so if Canada wants to move a tiny part of a percentage point, it means that it has to invest so much more than these other countries. And so another way that, we could look at this is looking at I have some figures that I could show you, but I think that that's extremely important to point out, is that for other countries with smaller economies, reaching 2% and getting there is a lot easier. This was also important, and nobody has mentioned this, and I talk about it in my book, which is called Beyond 2%. You're invited to read it. Is the fact that 2% was interesting, and it came out. In fact, the first mention of it was around 1998. Well, what happened in 1999 was the first round of enlargement. It was a political target to aid those countries in Central and Eastern Europe and say, look, this is what we think is reasonable. Right. And now we're 20 years later. And so maybe NATO is thinking this is, we ought to rethink this conceptualization itself. Finally, I would point out, when it comes to, 2% is what countries spend, but that's not how NATO gets the money, for example, and so NATO itself has 3 different budgets. Right. And so those budgets are the civil budget, the security investment budget, and the military budget. And so we talk a lot about that military budget, but it's actually 3 budgets, and those budgets actually all have had different types of burden sharing formulas. So another thing that would be informative would be to actually look at how states agree to cut those budgets, amongst themselves. And so I did a little bit of data collection there and found some interesting things. So, for example, in the last 20 years, U.S. contributions dropped by 25% on average to these budgets. One of the reasons why the United States and other countries wanted enlargement was for these cost savings. And in fact, when you look 20 years on, the countries that most benefited would have been countries. The countries that benefited the most were Germany and the UK. Now, Germany, since 2018, has come back and started to spend more. Right. But the country that has actually benefited the most previous to the Russian invasion was the UK. And now what we have seen in the last cost share agreement is that the UK was forced to take more, and the UK and France have also kind of divided. They used to be kind of neck and neck in what they took. The other thing, which I'm shocked that since we have 2 links to Germany here and nobody has mentioned it, that actually Germany's budget share is now equal to the United States of the common and of the civil and military budgets. And I think that that's kind of ironic because, if that was the Americans, they'd be talking about it all over the place. So the fact that the Germans are underplaying that, I think, is quite amusing in the current political atmosphere. Finally, my point is that this whole myopia on defense spending in the political discourse functionally neglects all of the other contributions by other bureaucratic actors to NATO. And so people at foreign affairs are looking around public safety, disaster management, right? Budgets in all of these departments also go towards NATO in general. They all have budget lines to NATO, and kind of looking at that defense pact is pretty much just, eliminating all of those aspects. And so the other thing I did was I actually collected a little bit of data on social spending versus military spending for 23 NATO countries, because we all have that guns and butter argument. In fact, I wrote a PhD dissertation on it. And so I wanted to look at what it looks like today. And so I'm going to stop there with my myopia and neglecting what everybody else does. And some of these things are captured in how we staff NATO, but in general, the whole 2% neglects everything else that we do about NATO that is not that hardcore silo in military and defense. And as we know, public budgets are much larger than that. So I pass it on.
Yeah, I think that those three comments leave us with the understanding that NATO is actually much more sophisticated and complex an organization than we give it credit for when we have these broad brushstrokes conversations about defense spending, where the money goes, the outcomes, the outputs, inputs versus impacts, and how we divvy up budgets. But of course, one of the arguments that critics will make is that every dollar you put into defense is essentially dead money, because it's not money that you're spending on productivity, it's not money that you're spending on social citizenship, and so that a part of the explanation for why Western countries, and especially Canada, are so prosperous is precisely because of how relatively little they end up spending on defense, because it allows them to spend that money on a lot of other things. And if you look around the world, it's the countries that spend disproportionately on defense as a part of their GDP that tend to have significantly lower levels of prosperity and living standards. And so then the question is, so why is it that Canada has failed to meet the 2% commitment? And sort of in keeping the line going here, I guess I'll punt it to Ben Zyla to start us off with. So why is it that Canada has failed to meet the 2% commitment?
Well, let me add a couple of points, Christian, before I sort of dive into that. The first point is, I think when we look at Canada missing the 2% target, I think Canada is actually in good company. There's actually less than 50% of the current NATO membership that actually meets that 2% target. The second point is, as it sort of applies to every military around the world, or at least in the NATO context, how much is actually enough? So how much more do you actually need, or how much more does the military need in order to do what? And that leads me to the point of, well, if the current environment is sort of complaining and bashing on the military, and that Canada is not sort of coughing up enough for NATO, then the obvious question becomes, at least to me, and I share some of those concerns just sort of for reference points here, but then the analytical question becomes is, well, if we assume that Canada would come up with, let's say, 25 billion extra dollars, what actually would you do with those extra $25 billion per year? Like, where would that money go? It's one thing to say and call for more money, but it's another thing to actually know where the money goes. So to me, to just join the choir of beating on Canada and the government and various kinds of governments, whether it's a liberal government or the conservative government, is actually not very helpful in this regard, because what you actually need is an answer. If there would be more money, what are you going to do with that kind of money? Sort of the next point perhaps to make is, if we actually look at what Canada has done or accomplished with various kinds of resources and fiscal cutbacks and so forth, but if we actually look at the operational commitment for a second, from Canada to NATO's operations, so I4, S4, K4, and ISAF, you see Canada, and I can sort of walk us through those numbers, but you see Canada sort of playing a middle power role. So it kind of lands in the middle in all those kinds of force contributions. And picking up on what Anessa has actually said in my first book, it's called Sharing the Burden, Canada and its Middle Powers, I make exactly that argument to say that what NATO needed at the time when the first round of enlargement came along, what NATO needed the most was actually not tanks and aircraft carriers and whatsoever. it actually needed a political alliance. You needed to build a political alliance to fund institutions, internal institutions and structures that would actually support NATO and let NATO grow as an alliance. So I'm a little bit, I understand the argument of, calling for more money, but at the end of the day, how much is enough and what are you spending it for? I think needs some serious answers. And last point, if you allow me, Christian, is to say, and it's kind of related to this. You talked about this in your introduction. Part of the problem is money, yes, of course, but the other big part of the problem, and it's not unique to Canada. Germany has the same problem. The UK has a similar problem. France has a similar problem, is actually the bureaucracy. To sort of get procurement right and get it on time and on budget out of the door is that's where one of the big bottlenecks is, and money won't solve that problem. It's you need bureaucratic reforms to push that out.
Thank you, Ben. So, Anessa, why has Canada failed to meet the 2% commitment?
I mean, I think, we talked a little bit about the fact that there's not very much public appetite or public willingness to support going that far. And this is because, frankly, Canada has benefited from its geography for a long time and from the idea that it was not physically touchable by much of what was going on in Europe in terms of risks of security. Now, this has changed considerably in the last 5 or 6 years, right? Hybrid threats are very real. Disinformation is very real. And so, some of what has happened in the last, decade has been a little bit of this recognition that the threats that we face, the threats and risks of today, of today's security environment, are not those classic, realist threats that we were talking about, that NATO was created about, right? So that's one thing, is that as NATO, for an institution that was formed in 1949 with a very short treaty, if you compare it to the European Union and the UN, it is extremely robust. It has done very interesting things institutionally, given what it has. And so, but I think at the end of the day, Canada has not reached this because of a combination of, frankly, political will. It cannot be sold to voters, but also as I pointed out, the idea that a lot of what we contribute to NATO is not necessarily in that military bottom line. And I think that in Canada particularly, we are going to see this more and more in the next several years with Canada's hosting of a NATO Center of Excellence on climate change and security. Of all of the centers of excellence, this is the issue. This is the domain in which I see NATO is now moving further and further away from that comfort zone of being siloed in defense and security, right? And so there's going to be a public awareness piece, but also it means, like I said, very much the things that we're contributing to NATO are not necessarily 100% in that defense line. And so opening up this, what our contributions is going to be important there. And finally, the other thing we saw is that there was some, suggestion that Canada would be willing to try and beg for an exemption to it. So I wonder what that would look like. And if Canada was able to procure an exemption, boy, wouldn't that annoy a lot of other countries. And so I'm not sure that would be the best strategy, but I think that Canada would definitely try it.
Anessa, thank you. Elliot Hughes, why has Canada failed to meet the 2% commitment?
Well, it hasn't really needed to be totally honest. And I think Ben and Anessa touched on this point. But just to pick up on a point that Anessa mentioned specifically, over the last number of elections, I can't think of a party that has said that they commit fully that they will spend 2%. A lot of them talk about we will work towards 2%, or we will sort of have an upward spending track towards 2%. Pretty vague language. And so, there hasn't really been a commitment put to Canadians and a test put to Canadians and a vote put to Canadians on a up or down, yes or no on 2% spending. And so I guess I would just challenge Anessa just slightly in saying, I don't think anyone's really demanding this. I don't think anyone's really expecting this. And when I say anyone, I mean Canadians in a sense. That hasn't, that license hasn't really been created, I think, for political parties, or it hasn't been a commitment that they've made and then been held to in a political way. And so I think there's a lot of other reasons why, but I also want to pick up on a point that Ben made, which is, once you take your foot off the gas over the last couple of decades of, getting used to internally in the bureaucracy of spending money on these projects, working amongst departments, just that process of engagement across the full thread of government. Once you get away from that, it's very difficult to put that engine back into gear. In my experience, having worked in government, and all of you will probably have seen this in one way, shape, or form. The departments, to get in line, that you need to get in line to get a program or some money spent. It's not only D&D and CAF, but it's PSPC, ISED, GAC, Finance, TBS, the Prime Minister's office, all at minimum, all have to be aligned and pushing in the same direction. And then in some cases, you might also have to add Veteran Affairs, Fisheries, Oceans, Coast Guard, Northern Affairs, Environment and Climate Change. The complexity of working with sort of two other departments is already a lot in government, from my experience. Having to do that with 5, 6, 7, 8 is hugely challenging. And it's made even more challenging when the issue isn't top of mind or a priority for the government. Indigenous reconciliation, social programs like the Canada Child Benefit or early learning and childcare. These were government priorities that the government ran on an election, are focused on. They are part of the Trudeau's legacy. These things took months and months and months of meetings and pushing and shoving and working within departments to get through. And so when you don't even have the buy-in of as a top issue, it makes it so much more challenging. And so I think getting back to this, why has Canada failed to meet the 2%? I think part of it is there hasn't really been a need or an expectation from Canadian voters. And then the challenge is, even if we did want to meet it and get it going, the time it would take and the focus and the synergy, I hate to use the word, but I will, within the departments within government that would need to sort of come together to get it done would just be an immense mountain to climb.
Yeah, so important points in a democracy where governments ultimately have to make trade-offs, and there's always competing commitments on social spending. We know that elections, especially in this country, are not won on foreign policy. I mean, the last election that I can think of that had a serious foreign policy component was 1988 free trade, and you might argue that wasn't really so much a foreign policy as sort of a continental hemispheric policy type issue. And of course, in the current circumstances, the puzzlingly named Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and this considerable pressures that it puts on economic competitive, not just in Canada, but in the among the European Union. And so, when you're a very large country with under perhaps 10 million or so taxpayers, there's a lot of competing pressures, especially in a country that is as diverse as Canada. And given that you need to build a broad tent in order to govern in this country, it means that there's a lot of different interests to appease. And this is a point that our colleague Craig Stone from the Canadian Forces College here also made sort of in the discussion. That he's weighing in that in economics terms, the 2% figure is just how much of a burden nations are putting on their citizens, and that Canada is not burdening its citizens as much as other NATO nations. And one of the other comments here is that Australia spends almost 2% on defense, and the audience member points out that they believe that Australia gets a lot more bang for their buck for a country that's 2/3 the economy and population size as Canada's. But of course, I would say that, if you look at Australia and you have half the world's population within 1,500 miles, and most of them aren't particularly friendly to Australia, and your country in the Battle of the Coral Sea was almost invaded, then that memory sticks in the minds of citizens. But you might also argue that perhaps Canadians have been somewhat naive about where the world is going, and so the mentality that we're far away from the world's problems, and the fireproof house mentality, as a senator in Canada famously called it, that no longer holds, and so that perhaps Canadians have rather outdated notions of security and defense spending and what they can get away with. And so my next question then is, under the country's current fiscal challenges, will any future government be able to meet the NATO commitment, especially if 2% becomes the floor rather than the ceiling? Anessa Kimball.
Well, I mean, again, presuming it's politically a viable strategy to try to do that, I think that, again, it's a bit of a challenge, and as we've seen, it's also a bit like spending on other security and defense. There's a logic that you can't get enough. Budgets are ever expanding, and so this also complicates things if you're trying to spend more, because we are always spending more, and budgets expand at different rates. And so, I think that I would say I don't think it's ever going to be something that's a political winner in Canada, more or less, as much as our allies would like us to do that. And so I would favor Canada trying to change the discourse or reconceptualize it a bit. I will pass it on.
Elliot Hughes, do you want to weigh in on this? So, under the country's current fiscal challenges, will any future government meet the NATO commitment, especially if 2% becomes the floor rather than the ceiling?
Yeah, I think this is something that I was thinking about in the lead up to this discussion, from with my political background and thinking about an election potentially in the horizon in 2024, and were there to be a change of government, what we might expect from a Pierre Poilievre government in terms of defense spending. And I have a hard time imagining Pierre Poilievre putting in an additional $15 to $20 billion annually into government in the Defense Department. So I think the short answer to that is no. But this is sort of where maybe I'm living in Denmark and sort of the oasis of social progress here and working together. As you probably know, there are some countries around the world who decide to take certain issues out of, let's say, the sort of cut and thrust of day-to-day politics. Denmark is one of those countries that works across party lines to develop, long-term defense plans, long-term foreign policy plans, and so on. I think it might be time for Canada to give this a real think and a real go. And I say that understanding that it might come across as a little naive and simplistic, but I would point to the current agreement that the government has with the NDP. This is essentially a coalition government in everything but name. And there is, I think, something there, and I think it's worth pursuing a little bit more, using the example of countries like Denmark, and I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Australia follows a somewhat similar model or approach. But I'm happy to be told differently on that one. And so, this, as we know, defense plans, come and go per government, and that is just terrible. We cannot align defense plans, these long-term investment plans, with the political cycle. It is a disastrous move. Having been in the minister's office in defense, I was helping, make announcements on, projects that were signed off by 3, 4, 5 defense ministers ago. And we were signing documents that we knew would be announced by the 3rd or 4th future defense minister. But there's something there about, let's take that out of the political process. Let's take this out of that cut and thrust. Let's get parties, representatives from each parties, sit down, sit in a room and negotiate. What are our needs? What do we want to do? And what do we want to buy over the next 10 years, 8 to 10 years? And let's get some agreement on that so we can start taking the political sort of push and shoving out of the process, takes it out of the House of Commons, takes it out of, you know, the media, where there's a lot less heat and light on the issues. And parties agree to sign up and say, you know, we're going to stick to this one. If and when we come in, we're going to stick to it if and when we come in. You'll have parties like the New Democrats who will push for certain issues. You'll have parties like the Conservatives who will push for certain issues, and it's a negotiation. I think what we've seen in other countries, what we've seen with the negotiation around the supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and the NDP is very positive. If we can get a deal and get dental care going for Canadians, why can't we do that? Sort of buying some tanks, buying some guns, and so forth. So a bit simplistic, but I think, you know, this idea it has seen its time. It's too important an issue to, I think, kick around in the politics of the day-to-day.
Yeah, it's a really helpful analogy, I think, there that you draw. Ben Zyla, so under country's current fiscal challenges, is any future government going to be able to meet the NATO commitment, especially if 2% becomes the floor rather than the ceiling?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball in front of me that I can sort of just look into. But let me just pick up on what Elliot just mentioned, because I think it's an important point that ties also into some other point I want to make. So I think, analytically speaking, here I'm sort of putting my academic hat on a little bit, is what we don't really understand at the moment is how this process of burden sharing, first of all, to recognize that it is a process, an institutional process at NATO, and secondly, that this process has agency. So in other words, how countries, member states, and individuals in the minister's office, in the various kinds of bureaucracies, actually practice burden sharing. So in other words, how do they go about this on an everyday basis? Is it in the minister's office, or do we perhaps then need to take it out of the political marketplace and sort of, you know, find a common understanding of what to do? But really to study the practices of NATO burden sharing in contemporary times, and then of course comparatively, is a huge gap in the literature at the moment. And secondly, if you want to do this historically, we really don't know how this practice of NATO burden sharing has actually panned out since 1949. We always hear the Americans complaining about the Europeans, certainly in the documents, up until the mid-60s or so, the documents are available. We certainly hear the Americans complaining about the Europeans not coughing up enough money for the collective defense. But we really don't know what are the patterns and how have these patterns changed, certainly in the 1990s. I had the privilege to interview some senior NATO folks over in Brussels, and it was very evident to me that there is a certain way of going about negotiating these sort of collective burdens. So all the countries sort of come to the table, are grilled by NATO as an institution, but they're also given the opportunity to actually make an argument, to make a case for why they're only spending X amounts or X percentages on NATO. And that leads me to actually the second point, where I think there's a big gap, and that is any Canadian government, as far as I can think of, has really done a poor job explaining to Canadians of why NATO is important to us as Canadians, and why it's perhaps not sort of meeting the 2% target. So in other words, to explain to Canadians of why we're underspending in NATO, and how is that kind of playing out in the political marketplace? So in other words, we're missing an explanation of why, an understanding of why countries behave in a certain way. And that not only applies to Canada, there's different polities, of course, in every country. So whether you take the Germans or the Americans or whatever, each country has a unique understanding of these collective burdens and kind of negotiates them uniquely in their polities. So in other words, again, the point is we need to understand the practice of NATO burden sharing much better than we currently do. And certainly we need to move away from the sort of static rationalist argument that, you know, whatever you kind of put into the NATO organizations kind of produces X amounts of outputs. You're missing an entire analytical perspective of agency actually is involved. People are involved, structures are involved, and people inform structures and vice versa. And last point, Christian, if you allow me, which kind of ties into this, is we really need to move beyond this input variable. And we need to think about output variables, but what I would suggest is actually an impact variable. So in very simplistic terms, if you, let's say, deploy 1,000 troops to a certain region to execute whatever mandate that was given to those troops by NATO, compared to, let's say, 100 special forces guys who kind of arrive on the ground and achieve the same or execute the same mission much quicker, less amounts of troops, and of course, perhaps less costly. So in other words, what are the impacts of less troops on the ground versus, let's say, 1,000 troops on the ground? So in other words, we need to overcome this sort of static conceptualization of measuring, of using metrics that really miss the qualitative analysis point. Like we can crunch the numbers, that's one side, and it's an important aspect. But we also need to add context and analysis to these kinds of numbers to get an understanding, and here I'm speaking in the sort of Weberian sense, to get an understanding of what it is that we're really talking about when we talk about NATO burden sharing.
Yeah, those I think are key observations. We have this conversation that inherently different countries, different soldiers get and different capabilities generate different sort of impact, and that probably, you know, as I've argued elsewhere, for instance, Canada has never been very good at articulating that investment in Arctic security and hemispheric defense is ultimately investment in NATO, because if the continent isn't secure, then allies can't rely on U.S. extended deterrence and U.S. extended nuclear deterrence in particular. So these relationships, and of course, Elliot's point, well taken. The effort that Australia, Denmark, also France make at having a bi/multipartisan approach to defense, and as part of their broader sort of national strategy that tries to take it out of some of the political decision-making matrices. So my next question for you then is, what's the domestic and international significance of Canada failing to reach the 2%? And I guess what comes to mind in this context is Olaf Scholz with the invasion of Ukraine, immediately saying Germany's going to put 100 billion into defense. Now, of course, Germany has since watered down that particular commitment and what the money is going for, but it was a clear signal that European security decisions are not going to be made without Germany at the table and Germany having a key voice in what's going to be decided. So what are the domestic and international significances of Canada failing to reach the 2%? Elliot Hughes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way I looked at this is, I think it's a loss of potential jobs and economic activity that some of this defense spending could have generated. I mean, but that to me is what jumps out. I think there's, nationally, that there's lots of places you could kind of go with this, but just to play devil's advocate slightly as well on this point, nationally, it also probably means sort of less procurement missteps, less sort of potentially bungling of money within government. And it also means perhaps more spending on social programs that impact people's lives a little bit more directly. Now, obviously, that's, we're not talking, there's money there that sort of is still unspent, so to speak, which I get. But, for me, nationally, I mean, the complacency of, really not working towards 2% right away and just sort of letting it slide and not being punished by voters, I think in a sense, it's given governments a pass. And that means governments sort of take that inch and keep sort of going on it. And the significance to me on that is it kind of has a wider impact than simply on defense spending. It's a bad habit, I think, for governments to have, which is, oh, well, we've signed up to this commitment internationally, but we're not really going to be punished that badly. Let's not sort of worry too much about it. That habit, I think, is unfortunately can get into people's heads and government's heads, and it sort of starts to go around in other departments, into other decision-making processes, and so on. So I think, those are some thoughts on the national point. Internationally, I think, frankly, I mean, the impact and the implications and significance of us failing to meet it, I think it's been pretty mild, if I'm being totally honest. Sure, we perhaps are not involved in certain discussions, and maybe we're not at the big girls and boys table, so to speak, and really one of those key actors. But I guess the question is if we were meeting 2%, maybe NATO would be able to point to us and use us as an example and say, look, Canada is doing that, and so on. But we've largely been able to escape sort of any serious impacts. We've got the big brother to the south of us who kind of, for better for worse, look after us and look in on us. And while our reputation may have taken a slight hit, I still think that Canada is viewed pretty well internationally, even if we haven't met the 2%. Sure, there's some grumbling here and there, but generally, I think the impact internationally and the significance of us not meeting the 2% has not been as sort of bad as it could be. And that kind of harkens back to an earlier discussion where I think you have to be a bit careful when you give people a hard time for not meeting their commitment. So I think the challenge is both nationally and internationally. Government, Canada, has not felt much pain at not meeting 2% yet. And while I suppose, happy and pleased at that, it also leads to and can create some bad habits. And that when times do get very serious for us, which they inevitably will in one way, shape, or form, it puts us at a tremendous disadvantage and in a pretty tight spot.
Ben Zyla, what's the domestic and international significance of not meeting the 2%?
I'm here with Elliot in the sense that I think for one, we're actually in good company. Less than 50% of the current NATO membership actually meets the 2% target. So I don't see any big sort of ramifications for Canada other than some grumbling here and there, and certainly the Canada-US grumbling is kind of a normal, I would suggest. Internationally, at the NATO level, yes, Trudeau will probably get some bad press in July when the heads of state meet again. But from my conversations, from the interviews that I conducted at the NATO headquarters, I didn't detect any such thing as people talking negatively about Canada. Quite to the contrary, actually, they are carving out, NATO officials were carving out the important political role that Canada plays in the alliance. And that, again, underlines the point that NATO is not only a military alliance, it actually also has a huge political component to it. And this is where I would suggest Canada can perhaps do a little bit of a better job to sort of carving out where it contributes to. It doesn't really do a good job in advertising its Arctic commitments, or its at least what it tries to do. NORAD modernization is a huge expenditure. It's not very well advertised, certainly not in the Canadian media, but it is recognized amongst NATO allies that this is part of what would contribute to the 2% target. Namely the defense of the North American continent. And last but not least, there's a big question, of course, the aid that was provided to Ukraine, military, political, but also humanitarian. Does that count towards the 2% target? And is that something that perhaps needs to be better sold politically by our political masters? And if I think any government can sort of hone up its skills and promote and advertise those commitments a little bit more, I think Canadians would better understand of where this 2% debate comes from and where Canada actually lands. But again, from my conversations with high-ranking NATO officials, there's no such thing that I could detect that would say Canada is a bad ally.
Yeah, different conceptions of security, the European Union, European neighborhood policy, and so forth, were spending in areas that that perhaps countries such as the US spend less in, and that all the support for various EU missions. Anessa Kimball, what are the implications of both domestic and international of not meeting the 2%?
So I just popped up a little presentation here. So we have a little idea because we're talking about whether they meet it or not. And so I gave you a little graphic here. And so you can see I put 2% right in the middle there. And what you have here is 2014 versus 2020. And so obviously this is interesting because it's after the Russian, annexation of the Ukraine. So this would arguably have been in a period after we should have seen some movement. And so what we do see is that, yes, several countries did significantly increase their spending over this period. Now, what does that say for what are NATO's main goods? I mean, like I say, we're bringing this back to the key point that, what NATO produces is collective defense, cooperative security, and crisis management. And it's not clear at all that 2% spending on military brings out those goods. And otherwise, also, we have to think about the fact that really, as bargaining scholars would suggest, these are really sets of iterated, simultaneous bargaining games that are going on. And in my book, I try to make this a little bit clearer, in particular for our European allies. Canada and the United States are in a privileged situation because there are not requests to join EU missions, right? And so I make clear in the analyses in my book that one of the things that happened, particularly after 1990, is that there was very selective choice in the missions that were selected by NATO partners, whether they were NATO missions, whether they were EU missions. And particularly after 2014, we saw the redistribution of resources, for example, by countries that were in the Central and Eastern Europe, away from maritime missions and towards those missions that were facing their immediate needs, right? So, the whole idea that all of the countries are meeting the 2% and maybe we're not getting what, NATO's not providing the goods, I think that's simply false. I think that we're not looking at the right types of things. Benjamin brings up a great point when he talks about, what are these impacts? And one of the things I think, Canada needs to focus on more or highlight more is the fact that, Canada is the smallest economy among the G20, but it's the only one that is also, leading a battle group. Every other country leading a battle group is a top 5 contributor of NATO. Canada is the only country that is leading a battle group that has the most partners and the most languages. Every Canadian hates this, but I keep saying NATO thinks Canada is multilingual and NATO keeps giving Canada that job. Because this is a place where it thinks Canada has a comparative advantage in leadership. And so this is something that, and so when we look at what's going on in enhanced forward presence, the fact that Canada, despite its small economy, despite only having 1.4%, is actually doing the same thing everybody else is doing, and doing quite well at it, and I can say this because actually I recently met the Lithuanian ambassador to Canada and I spoke with him about EFP. And so he talked about, how essential it is that Canada's there. And so I think that that's another thing. And so the idea that, NATO needs these benchmarks to understand, how its allies and partners are contributing. And so again, we have these multiple bargaining games that are essentially the budget shares, that are the missions. There are punctual missions and there are continuing missions. We have to separate out those things because they're also very different needs. So like continuing missions, like the maritime missions, are not nearly as risky as the missions where you could possibly get shot at, right? And the fact that we're kind of lumping these all together is also problematic. And so, in my book, I actually show you the 160 missions that have been undertaken by international organizations since 1949. And I do a study on all of the missions since 1990, and try to get at this because, frankly, we often conflate a mission of one organization is a UN mission more important than an EU mission than a NATO mission, right? And at the end of the day, states make those choices based on the political environments at home and which or international organization they think is probably going to have the best probability of delivering the goods. And that has been NATO. For the last 20 or 30 years, it has moved into this space. And so there needs to be a little bit of kind of recognition, but also that NATO didn't necessarily jump into this space. It was asked into this space by actors like the UN and by actors like the EU. And so I think that that's also an important thing that doesn't get very much recognition in the media. And so, yeah, I think that, and I'll pass it on because I have other things for the alternatives, but in terms of why these are necessary, this is how we know allies are contributing to the collective.
Look, it's fantastic conversation, and all three of you provide terrific context. And so the next question is, does NATO need a uniform benchmark for assessing burden sharing and member contributions? But let me put that in a context. So David Perry from CDA-CDI here brings up the point that about spending targets such as the 20% spending towards equipment and related research and development, so that there are things that we can measure sort of reasonably consistently and concretely. So does NATO need a uniform benchmark for assessing burden sharing and member state contributions? And can, for instance, what David Perry mentions here, help get us there? Ben Zyla.
I would actually argue that what we currently need is a better understanding of the practices of NATO burden sharing. Like I said before, we need to look at how decisions are made, by who, in which kind of situational context, because we really don't know at this point how these kinds of decisions are made and why they're made. We tend to assume it's sort of the bureaucracy somewhere, but we don't really understand very well how historical contexts play a role, how people play a role, how structures play a role. In addition to that, I don't think we actually know and have studied how burden sharing practices not only have evolved over time, but how bureaucrats and politicians perhaps have learned over the years how to share collective burdens and how to translate that into national burdens, because at the end of the day, Canadian taxpayers have to pay a certain share towards NATO. So in other words, what is the learning process? What have Canadian governments collectively since 1949 learned in terms of burden sharing practices?
Ben, I'll stop you there because I want to make sure we still get some of the alternatives in. So I just want to circle to Anessa on the question of a uniform benchmark. Anessa seems to be struggling, so why don't we go to Elliot first?
Okay,
and we'll
excuse
back.
me.
Oh, there she is. All right.
And so one thing that I think is interesting, and in an era in which we talk about human security and the value of every human life, I found this interesting table right here, which is defense spending per capita. And so you can see that approximately an American is worth about 33 times the value of an Albanian, which I think is a little bit shocking. When you look at it, if we're talking about social justice, I think that this may be something to look at, right? How much is every partner spending, and are we actually valuing every human life in the alliance the same way? And going to that kind of trade-off between social spending and military spending, one thing I also did was take 20-some countries and plot out this idea of social spending versus military spending. And so what you have, and what is very, very clear is that the ratio is extremely when it comes to defense spending, we are looking at less than 5% of all total spending, and when we come to social spending, this is ranging somewhere between 40 and 60%. So, frankly, the idea that we're spending it all on defense is a little bit of a misnomer when you actually look at the data. And this is, the defense expenditure data that's crossed with OECD data. So I think that there are other ways that we can think about this, which might give us more purchase than just that 2%, that 2% point.
Elliot Hughes.
Yeah, I as much as I don't love it, I think that it is important to have a uniform benchmark. as frustrating as it is powerful in its simplicity. And there is a target for people to work towards. And frankly, it's up to those countries to decide whether they want to try and do that and how much heat they're willing to take. I'm by no means as knowledgeable about this topic as the others on the panel, but I've yet to really see a compelling case for what an alternative would be that is also as simple to convey and to message and to explain. And so until those two things get ticked off and sort of checked off, unfortunately, I think we do need to stick with a number, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, the next SecGen may decide that it is the floor and rather than the ceiling, and it could become a little bit more pointy in their commentary around it.
So let's spend the last sort of 90 seconds each on sort of what are the alternatives to the 2%, and in particular in reference to Anessa's terrific article. How might NATO Centers of Excellence factor into burden sharing debates?
And so, I came to studying NATO Centers of Excellence because one of their unique aspects is the fact that NATO members cannot say that their contributions to NATO Centers of Excellence go towards NATO's central budget or any of those things, right? And so these are really institutions that are external to NATO's structure, its command structure. They are asked and not tasked. And what is also interesting is that they are how NATO is trying to adapt the alliance to the future. And so if there was any environment in which we should be looking at what future collaboration will look like and what is the practicality or the function or practice of burden sharing, one might say, it's going to be these institutions. And so I'm excited because in a couple months, I'm leaving to go do field work at 5 different NATO Centers of Excellence. And I'm going to ask a bunch of questions and figure out exactly how they do this piece, which is sharing the burden inside these centers, but also, doing the feedback to the NATO countries themselves. And this is in particular in relation to Canada's the CASCO, which will be the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, which is coming. It's going to be in Montreal, and it's supposed to stand up before the end of this year. And so if you haven't been following that file, the government has been working extremely busy on this file. I can say I have been in workshops with upwards of 100 people from all of our NATO allies. And so, if there is one environment where I think that, we could have a microcosm of trying to understand this, I think we have kind of a little experiment that we are going to launch right here in Canada in the next year. And so I look forward to seeing how that's going to work out.
Yeah, we'll see what Canada does. I mean, the charisma of the Centers of Excellence is that, by and large, they don't feed into NATO decision making, and they don't feed into shape in a timely fashion. So that they're sort of appendages. But we'll see whether Canada can do better than some of the other ones. Elliot Hughes. So, can the Arctic play a role in burden sharing?
Yeah, and it's sort of a point that I think Ben raised early on, which is, how do you connect the issues that we've been discussing today more directly with Canadians' everyday lives? And the angle that I tried to take in the piece is perhaps one way of doing that is this sort of region that I think is interested and will become more interesting in the future to Canadians, and that's the Arctic. It not only has a huge strategic importance to the country, but there's tremendous upside, whether it's sort of on the economy side. It's going to become much more important as the climate continues to change, and geopolitically, it's definitely hotting up as well. And so, this connection that Canadians have with the Arctic perhaps is one way to get this in a little bit more in sort of people's minds, and to say, this is how we could potentially get closer to that 2%. It's a bit of a sort of a twist on the question, which is sort of what are the alternatives to 2%? But the point of the piece is really about perhaps this is another way to get closer to 2%. Let's attack the problem in another direction, rather than just saying to people, hey, we need to be more secure in this very dangerous world, don't you agree? Let's try and find a way to sort of link it a lot more directly to the lives of everyday Canadians. And that's not easy. And it's a little bit abstract, even with the Arctic, but I think it's a path well worth taking and considering.
Yeah, certainly a valuable way to try to reframe the problem and the conversation and to have sort of a positive sum and synergistic outcomes on defense spending, making it more relevant and immediately pressing for Canadians. Ben Zyla, so we talk a lot about input and output variables, and you're trying to change the conversation to talk about outcome and impact variables. Do you want to explain those to us briefly and why they matter?
Yeah, sure. So what we've been talking about, the GDP as a percentage of defense spending is kind of an input variable. The output variable is like what I've suggested in our discussion is look at, how many troops Canada has deployed on certain kinds of missions. But the impact variable is something that we haven't really discussed yet in the literature. So it's a real gap, and really what it is, it's kind of it takes the insights from development impact evaluations, essentially. So looking at how do you evaluate projects on a long-term basis, and impacts are really sort of 5 to 10 years impact assessments of your initial contributions towards an operation. So in other words, what impact did Canada make, for example, in the Balkans? And what are those kinds of impact variables that we can actually study? So at the end of the day, let me perhaps in the 10 seconds that I have left, sort of try to summarize a couple of things. One is, I think we're going to have to move beyond quantitative assessments of burden sharings, sort of open it up with a qualitative perspective and look at sort of civilian dimensions, or what I've called civilian burden sharing. Look at military burden sharing, look also at research and development, look at technology and investments into technology, but move beyond sort of simply looking at the numbers. Like I said, they're important, but also provide a qualitative assessment. And secondly, and that is sort of thinking about the broader strategic concept. If we buy into the argument that we are indeed living in a changing global order, there is perhaps a niche role, a unique Canadian political role to play in this changing global order. And I think our political masters should perhaps carve out those contributions that Canada could make in this changing global order with the crisis and with the war in Ukraine a little bit more carefully, to explain to us what it is Canada can bring to the table on the one hand, but on the other hand, also sort of justify then what Canada is doing and how it is doing and why it is doing certain things. I'll leave it.
Can I just jump in one small point, just very quickly? I know we're pressed for time. I'm unconvinced that Canadians, in a way, would actually sort of welcome more CAF D&D engagement globally. I don't think we're sure of that. And this is a point that Ben made earlier on. When you start to spend more money, you can do it on IT, you can sort of, recapitalization, whatever you want. But eventually, at some point, you're going to have to get out into the world a little bit more. And I'm not quite sure Canadians have the stomach for some of those adventures. I mean, Afghanistan still looms very large. And I just don't know if we're willing to be as sporty as perhaps some of the other countries. And I think that's something that we need to test and prod as well at some point, before we just jump into saying we need to spend more money, let's spend more money because we need to spend more money.
Okay, I think those 3 concluding comments are terrific observations, just like the entire conversation here, because of course, our NATO commitment in some ways has recently changed with the new strategic concept, right? So we went from 3 priorities to 5. It's collective defense and deterrence. It's crisis management and conflict prevention. Those are 2 different different things. And then the cooperative security piece. And of that, only collective defense is really is really existential. The others are discretionary. And so I think there's a good point to be made here about what are Canadians willing to stomach, and how do we actually measure and explain to Canadians that they're actually getting something for their return. But then again, of course, politicians can also be reticent to actually measure what they're getting for the return, because then they might be able to be held accountable for that, rather than just making a political statement by deploying this particular instrument of foreign policy. So, look, I want to thank you for what I found and a very enlightening discussion. And you complement each other very well. Thanks for also being relatively brief in your responses. So I want to thank Anessa Kimball from Université Laval, Elliot Hughes, former Director of Policy to Minister of National Defence and Deputy Director for the Minister of Finance, and Ben Zyla from the University of Ottawa. And now over to Robert Baines, CEO and President of the NATO Association of Canada, for some closing remarks.
Yeah, and Christian, thank you to you for taking us through such a wonderful discussion. Anessa, Ben, Elliot, a real pleasure to hear all of this. But I think all of you are more or less on the same page that we just need more clarity. And I think the government might be realizing that if we are going to be getting notices in the media saying that we are behind our hands, saying, well, there's no way we're ever going to reach 2%, we should at least be clear about that. And I think Canada should go some way to trying to explain all of the multifaceted and in sometimes almost ephemeral ways that Canada assists NATO and makes sure that NATO can do what needs to be done. And likewise, explaining why NATO is important, which of course is our bread and butter as well. All of you on this panel, in your own way, contribute to that in a tremendous way. So I want to thank you again for that. And all of those who are listening, please stay engaged. Please continue to engage with the NATO Association of Canada. And anytime somebody that you talk to in your day-to-day work, in your family, in your social circles, start talking about international engagement, just realize that you are part of the discussion. So you need to make sure that people hear some of the messages we're talking about today and Canada's importance as a support of the rules-based international order. So thank you all again, and can't wait to speak to you at our next event. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right.